tonight I invite you again to listen and reflect with us during this panel discussion with a greater focus on Lancaster County. I want to especially thank Lancaster County Community Foundation for supporting this Community Now session as they did the last session. You know, we convened this panel to reach for a greater shared understanding about what's happening. We have three wonderful panelists with different backgrounds and expertise and perspectives who have so generously agreed to share their time with us tonight and reflect. I really appreciate them adding this task at a time that's filled with so much uncertainty, hard work, and community concern and responsibilities for so many of us. So thank you to the panelists. Let me introduce them. Tonight we have Lydia Henry. She served most recently as Chief Operating Officer for Atomic Design on the campus of Rock Lidditz in Lidditz, Pennsylvania. She has over 25 years of business leadership experience. She's an advocate for integrating growth and development strategies into company operations and is extremely interested in addressing the changing business environment to allow for a whole life that's fulfilling and achievement-oriented. Prior to joining Atomic, Lydia served on leadership teams of several Lancaster County organizations. Welcome, Lydia.
Thank you so much, Stacy, and thanks to the Y for doing this series. I think it's a wonderful thing.
Thanks. Tonight we also have Ariana Camel, Director of the Center for Health Education and Promotion at Millersville University. Ariana is a health and well-being specialist who's been recognized nationally for focusing in on peer education and advocacy efforts in higher education. She's a 2017 and 2019 graduate of Millersville University, dedicating most of her educational experience to giving back to the Lancaster community. She's worked as a mentor in Penn Manor School District and with the Lancaster Food Hub and Women and Children's Winter Shelter Program. Her interests are holistic health and well-being and using a social justice lens. Welcome, Ari.
Thanks for having me, Stacy.
Yes. And finally, let me welcome Jeremy Jenkins. Jeremy has spent the last 2 years reporting for Susquehanna Valley's #1 news station, WGAL 8. He acts as a fill-in anchor and reporter in Dauphin and Lancaster County. Previously, Jeremy worked in Tyler, Texas. And outside the newsroom, he's been recognized in a number of communities for his work as a volunteer and community advocate. Thanks, Jeremy, so much for joining us.
Of course, thank you so much for having me, Stacy. I am just honored to be a part of this conversation this evening.
Great. So as we proceed, folks on the call are invited to ask questions or share comments using the chat functions. My great colleague, Adam Hosey, is skillfully managing these systems, and we'll have time for those questions later. So let's begin. What's happening in Lancaster County? Lydia, to start us off, you know, this weekend I saw a couple of lists of major companies around the nation who are already committed to changing their practices, their philanthropy, even their brands in response to calls for racial equity. From your vantage point, what are you seeing along those lines in our county?
I think it's you know, like anywhere, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. And I think in the last several weeks, we've seen many local companies come out with statements denouncing racism, denouncing the systemic nature of it, and talking about the required policy change, and in some cases, committing to be a part of that change. And then in other companies, you know, in other cases, you haven't seen much of a statement at all, and you've seen some folks, some of which has been reported in the press, literally not kind of rising to the occasion, if you will. Something I'm really seeing with county businesses is an emphasis on training, education, learning, which I think is really good. I'm seeing companies talking to employees of color to get their feedback and also just talk. But then again, you're also hearing stories, again, some of which are reported, where that's not happening. So I think you're going to have a real mixed bag in the business environment. to give an example of some of the learning and some of the educational efforts that are being recognized as being necessary, I'm very familiar with Rocklidditz, having been most recently working with Atomic Design, and I know that they've been working to bring a group together to have a book discussion using the book So You Want to Talk About Race, and have then some good discussion, and hopefully out of that look at kind of the history of inequity, how do we remove bias from the workplace, and kind of have some real hands-on discussion in the companies that comprise Rocklidditz, which is a number of organizations. Additionally, and you all may be really familiar with this, but there's the group of businesses called In Good Company that that was convened late last year. Lancaster County businesses. It was convened by Assets, the Lancaster Chamber, and the Lancaster County Community Foundation. And those businesses came together under the impetus of using their business for good, using their business for good in the community, working to impact community health in tangible ways. They recently also issued an open letter condemning the recent acts, and in particular talking about wanting to use their business to really help with regard to systemic racism, and hitting on recruiting practices and pay equity and some very specific issues. And the folks that signed that open letter were from very, very large Armstrong World Industries, for example, to smaller organizations like Two Dudes or Next Book Media, and then everywhere in between. So some really large, Penn Medicine, and some really large organizations. So I think, we're seeing a little bit of a mixed bag, but we are definitely seeing businesses stepping in and taking note. And I think also, and something I hope we have a little bit of time to talk about tonight, I think that business is in a unique position to really be a part of the solution for a variety of reasons. But to do that, we really have to engage openly and honestly. And, that's not always easy. And so hopefully we'll see that coming.
Thank you, Lydia. Thanks so much. That's a good overview, and I'm glad you brought up In Good Company. And really, folks can check out that site and see the businesses who have signed the pledge and are really interested in stepping up right now. Jeremy, I'd like to turn to you. Your work brings you all over the county, and I know we were in contact last week when YW posted a Black Lives Matter banner, because I was asking you if you had seen those in other places around the county. So I'm curious, I know you've covered a couple of stories about protests, about Juneteenth celebrations, and other events in recognition of the current movement. Is there anything that sticks out to you as particularly surprising or hopeful in Lancaster County?
Stacey, I'll tell you what really sticks out to me, and that's the unity of the people in our community. And a lot of these protests around the nation, if you're watching the national news, you will see that a lot of these cases, there's a lot of violence involved. And that's not necessarily been the case here. There may have been one or two rallies that I think where police had to really heavily be involved and lock down the city. But in most of them, they're very peaceful, and people honestly want to know one thing: why is racism not ending? And in a lot of those cases, it's good to see the unity of people coming together of all different backgrounds asking that question. And as a journalist, you never pick one side. It's your job, or our job, to look at what's going on and say, okay, how can we bring these voices together? So in the interviews that I've done, people are a lot more aware than you really want to give them credit for. I think seeing that people understand there is a problem, and not just generationally, but all over the spectrum, people from ages, early teens, late 20s to even in the early 40s to late 60s, people are all asking questions. And that's a good thing, because most times as a journalist, we're trying to get the information from people. But now it's like the tides have turned and people want to get the information from us, and they want to know these things. And so that's what I've been finding.
I really like how you gave that example at the end of people really so interested in getting information right now. And I think that we see that playing out, of course. Thanks for that, Jeremy.
No
So
problem.
Ari, let me bring you into this. You're a recent graduate of Millersville with an advanced degree, I might add. You know, this weekend on Twitter, another thing I saw was a photo that had surfaced of women from Lancaster County who were members of the KKK. And the photo was them arriving in Washington, D.C. in 1925 for a KKK rally down Pennsylvania Avenue. And they had their sign holding up saying Lancaster County. And then, you know, I looked into that a little bit and I saw that just a couple years ago in 2017, there were planned rallies in this county again, in the southern part of the county. So that indicates, you know, a continued presence of this group. So as a student, a resident on campus, you know, what is the climate and conversation like? You know, across the nation, we see a lot of movement leaders that are very close to your age, sometimes because the leaders within the systems are not moving at the pace that others expect. So talk to us about what you're seeing on campus, who's leading, tell us some more about what's happening.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that the pandemic has played a huge role in the way the civil unrest has changed. Beginning in March, when classes let out pretty much for the fall semester, we got stuck with Asian discrimination because of COVID-19. And before that, we're still locking kids in cages and families in cages. And then with the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, and most recently some other people, the students have had a rough time, and a lot of them don't feel supported. And I don't ever doubt what Millersville can do, but we can always do more. The students have been asking for more. There are some structural changes that need to be made as far as when the campus was built. I mean, it was built in 1855, before the first slaves were freed. So during that time, people that looked like me couldn't even go to Millersville. So there's some structural changes that need to happen as well on that campus. But students have experienced many things over the past few months. And with there being a pandemic, it has only caused more distress. And so what we're seeing now is pretty much an educational breakdown. Students are realizing, especially myself being a former student, I had a very whitewashed education. I'm originally from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So when there were KKK gatherings here, they were just a mile or so from my house. And so experiencing that and then coming to Lancaster and being here when they had planned rallies in 2017, it didn't scare me as much as it had scared many other peers of mine, because it was something I was almost used to. But we're seeing this thing where students are recognizing and being filled with not only just anger, but encouragement to do something about this change. Because it shouldn't take someone to go to higher education to understand the background of African Americans in this country. It should not have taken me 20 years to receive that education. And a lot of students are feeling that, both whether they're people of color or whether they're not, they're frustrated. And so when you have people like Rita Smith-Waddell, who was the first interaction for a lot of students coming through that university. And she was a force to be reckoned with. She was the first probably upfront, blunt, unfiltered Black person that people had even met. So to get to that point and not have had any of that education prior, or at least experience anything prior to that, yeah, it caused a little unrest in some students. But I'm really excited to hear that students are wanting to, get together and fight back and create a place that is welcoming for all students, who, no matter who they are. As far as your question about who is leading that, I would absolutely say the students. I'm not saying that staff and faculty and administration aren't backing students, but our students are probably some of the best students to come across in this nation. And I don't just say that because I'm a former alum, whether I'm a former athlete or whoever. I truly believe that our Millersville students have an educational background. They have the spirit of a true leader to want to bring change to this world. So I hope that answers all your questions there. And I definitely encourage people who have questions about Millersville and some of the changes to ask those as well.
Ari, thanks a lot for that. I want to follow up on one thing you said to make sure, in case anyone is unclear, talk a little bit more what you mean when you say whitewashed history.
Yeah, so whitewashed history would mean that we kind of leave out the parts that make us uncomfortable. I know some of us had heard the lines of, we didn't think slavery was as bad as it was. Daughters of the Confederacy really helped change that. Definitely in the South, when they changed those books to say things that once they were done picking cotton in the fields, the masters brought them in to have a good meal. That's not what happened. Let's be real. In the ways that we're talking about how slaves were punished and how they were treated, they weren't humans to white people. They were not. And so in our history books, we're looking at history that has just been covered up. But now we are starting to see a reverse in that, and where we're adding in Black stories, and we're adding in stories of people of color, especially with Indigenous women still going missing. That should not be happening in this time. It should not be continuing to happen. And when we think about Thanksgiving and how during kindergarten we're learning about how, you know, the Indians and the people from the Mayflower, they came together and had this big thing, but we're not talking about the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of people in their culture. So when I talk about whitewashing history, I'm talking about the erasing of the true things that were happening and making the dominant group feel a little bit better about what's happened, which in that case is not a feel-good story.
Thank you, Ari. Thanks for that fuller explanation. I appreciate it. So you also have made a perfect segue for me into my next question. You know, so folks have touched a little bit on what they're seeing, what's been happening, and I want to just go a little bit deeper into why. Why is this happening? So Lydia, you know, as Ari was mentioning, our country and our county in particular is such a mix of interesting aspects. You know, for example, the entire Rockledge campus, very interesting. The manufacturing base here, the literal history of place here, the tourism. And so here's what I'm wondering. The county, and I really observed this as a newcomer, is promoted as Dutch country. And the first Amish arrived here, according to what's posted, in early to mid 1700s. But meanwhile, the county history also includes enslaved Africans being here from about that same time. And later, the area being a key part of the Underground Railroad. And I'm wondering, why is it that that aspect of the history here is so much less prominent? Why isn't this a selling point, a point of pride and tourism, the way the lives of Amish have become?
Sorry, a little slow on the unmute there. It's a really, really interesting point. And I do have a little bit of background from the tourism industry side of things. And, you know, to your point, tourism is the 6th largest industry in Lancaster County. So it has something like close to $3 billion impact. And yet that whole piece, it's not completely ignored, but it's for all intents and purposes just about completely ignored. And about 15 years ago, the Pennsylvania Dutch Convention and Visitors Bureau, it's now called Discover Lancaster, but it's the group that's responsible for promoting tourism of Lancaster County. They made a concerted effort under the leadership of their then CEO to bring these stories, and in particular, the history of the Underground Railroad. to the fore and to have them be promoted as a key tourism element in Lancaster County. And I'll tell you, Stacy, it never took off. And I don't know exactly why the necessary support or interest wasn't there. I mean, we can speculate, but it never took off. And there was, like I said, a very concerted effort made to do that. So I don't know if it's, the sense was, well, it won't sell, or there wasn't the research done to see that, or I don't know exactly, but there was a real concerted effort about 15 years ago.
That's so interesting, Lydia. I appreciate you sharing that, because I actually didn't know that there had been a concerted effort that hadn't apparently been quite as productive as people had hoped. And perhaps at this time, with that renewed interest,
yeah,
that would be something that could change.
Absolutely.
So Jeremy, I want to turn to you for a moment. You obviously have had a career in Arkansas and Texas before coming to Lancaster. And oftentimes people think of the southern states as having such a different attitude on race relations. And so from your time in the county, what have you seen or experienced in this regard? What's your take on that?
So I have a very interesting take on that, Stacy, because back home in Arkansas, it's one of those things where, I think Ariana hinted on this a little bit earlier, where sometimes we kind of make history a little bit more pleasant than what it actually is. All of my life, I had dealt with these little blurbs. And, now that we're in the climate we're in, I kind of went back and thought, well, maybe that was a little more racist than racial. I've definitely encountered in my time here in the Susquehanna Valley a number of individuals coming up to me personally, or whether it be through email or messages where, it was attacking my race, and that's not friendly. But to be honest with you, this has also happened in other territories where I've worked also. So it's nothing that's territorial. I would say the big difference in that would be that in the South, with bless your heart and oh honey this, oh dear that, we kind of, mask the meanness with, that little sweet Southern twang, whereas when you're in the Northeast, up here, we're straight shooters. We don't have time for all of that. So I would say that would be the biggest difference. But the one thing I can truly say here, out of all the instances overall, people in our community truly have open minds for the most part. People may say something or do something, but it's not out of malice. A lot of the times, as the old saying goes, ignorance is bliss. People may say things or do things and they don't truly understand what they're doing until afterwards. And I'll give you an example of that. One of the most recent things that occurred to me, my photographer and I were on a story in Lidditz. And a gentleman just walked up to me in the midst of us taping, and he said, you know what, I want to say to you, Native American lives matter. In that moment, he may not have thought that that was offensive to me, but in the midst of a Black Lives Matter movement, that was very offensive. And especially just coming up to me in the midst of my work and distracting me from that, it was quite jarring. So that's what I mean when I say ignorance is bliss. That may not have been intended to come off as what it did, but I was able to talk with that gentleman afterwards and say, hey, in the midst of a Black Lives Matter movement, all lives truly do matter. But the focus right now just happens to be on Black lives because of the climate that we're in and some of the events that have been happening in the world.
Yeah. Hey, Jeremy, thank you for sharing that story. And I'm sorry that happened to you. But really, I appreciate you sharing it, because it's such a great illustration of, as you mentioned, not only him, saying something that is offensive to you at this time in particular, but also you're a professional doing a job, and to, feel that you can be interrupted, that's, really out of bounds. And we wouldn't expect that to happen to most people when they're doing their jobs. So thanks for that example.
No problem.
Ari, I wanna talk to you a little bit about intersectionality. So this month is Pride, and across the country, most of the traditional parades and events that, you know, so many of us look forward to really mark this time and remember, they've been canceled. But also, I've seen a particular focus on, for example, Black trans lives matter, and some other efforts that link the current movement specifically to members of the Black community who are LGBTQ+. So what's your take on this? Again, are you seeing this intersectionality play out on campus or anywhere else in the county?
Yeah, I mean, considering we haven't been on campus for at least 3, almost 4 months, have not seen it on campus, but it does continue. It's not a new story. I think right now the focus on Black trans lives matters is really important for us to recognize right now, because we as Black people have not always recognized individuals in the LGBTQ plus community, specifically our brothers and sisters who are of color. And so the continued murders of our trans brothers and sisters and individuals is really important for us to acknowledge. And I think right now that the focus has turned, it has shown that we are able to recognize, love, understand, and empathize with other people who we may not agree with, and that's okay. Even yesterday with Jari Jones being able to be shown through Calvin Klein, and for someone such as this Black trans queer individual to be able to be put in a spotlight is so important for us as we continue to grow as a people. And so this intersectionality has always played out on our campus, especially when it comes to things back when Mike Brown was killed, and we had a lay down in the Student Memorial Center, and not recognizing that there is so much more to a Black individual than the color of their skin. So yes, I will say that the intersectionality continues to play out. I would also mention that us as a university has to continue to do more in creating spaces, because we haven't. We have not always created space for students who don't fit in a box. Most of us don't fit in a box. And for me, being a straight cisgender female, I can't speak too much on the experience, but I can speak to my allyship and the people I love who identify as someone who is not cisgendered and straight, that we need to start creating the space. And so when the murders of George Floyd happened and there was an uprising, it actually took a while for someone to create a space at the university for students, staff, faculty, and administration. Something I was a little disappointed in. And again, it shouldn't always be on one person. And I'm sure we'll get into this more, and I believe you got into this a few weeks ago, of there being a pinpoint person that everyone always goes to. And that is something that definitely happens on our campus as well, is that we ask someone to speak for all of us. And it's unfair to put someone in that position. And so as well, this focus on Black trans lives is really important, because now we're opening up. We were just focusing on Black lives, but now we need to recognize that it's not just Black lives, it's Black trans lives that are at risk. It is Black men at risk, Black women at risk, in many different capacities. So I think it is important, and that intersectionality plays a huge part in everything that we do.
Thanks for that great answer, Ari, because I think you illustrated there, especially at the end, you know, what we want to be able to amplify is the full expression of humanity for Black Americans in particular. Right now we're talking about, but, you know, being able to thrive and live your fullest life and achieve your dreams without, you know, as Reverend Sharpton said, somebody's knee on your neck is really, you know, what we want to support right now. So I want to, I'm looking here for the question section. Here is a great question from Eli. and anyone can jump on this. Have you seen any studies of K-12 curricula across states? I'm curious about commonalities of implicit bias, even in so-called progressive regions. I'm wondering if any of you have any specific information on that one. That's a great question.
So I don't have any specific information on that. I mostly stick in higher ed, but I will say some of the things you want to look at is the textbooks. So we know that low income schools, public schools will likely receive older books, or they won't receive new books for a really long time. And if they do, it's very minimal. So just checking to see when it was written, who it was written by, and looking into that as well. Because again, we still do have organizations that will just write whatever they want in there, and that's really important for us to recognize. Even as well, bringing in people with experience is always great for K through 12. We know that students aren't always book friendly. Sometimes they need that interactive, that physical piece. They need to see it, they need to talk to it, they need to do all these things. So changing up the curricula a little bit to shape what the student needs a little bit more, and whether that is bringing in, I think someone mentioned someone from the African American Historical Society, bringing someone in to talk about that and discuss some of the experiences that Black people have had in this country, as well as the wide array of different personalities and parts of people, and just discussing that a little bit more. But that would be my input for that. Again, I apologize, I don't have more information on K through 12, but that would be my start.
You know, one thing I will add to that, not a study of K-12 curricula, but there are a group of folks here in the county who are taking a really close look at something called the 1619 Project, which is an attempt to correct the narrative of American history. And so some of what Ari and Jeremy spoke about whitewashing history, or, you know, portraying a story in a certain way, you know, that's really an effort to use the full story. And there are curricula for K-12 on different aspects of American history that way. Here's a question. I feel like it might have Jeremy's name on it. Should the media be more engaged to seek out stories and new voices about Black Lives Matter movement in Lancaster County?
Absolutely. You can never get too much diversity within the media, if you ask me. I think what we do at WGAL absolutely exemplifies that. There are a number of reporters, and if you look at what we do, all of our stories are different. We oftentimes may continue one another's story, but I think in everything that we do, we try our best to look at what's going on as far as the climate and, you know, with Black Lives Matter, with what we've seen. There have been a number of stories regarding the protest, and when people wanted to speak, we go live coverage and we let them speak. And we talked about that. I think one thing that you have to also keep in mind is that just because you reach out to someone of a certain organization doesn't mean they're going to go on camera and speak to us. You have to kind of think about that as well, because a lot of people are involved in a lot of other organizations. You know, we do have a Capitol that's nearby. A lot of people are involved in state jobs and don't want to be on camera when it comes to these topics. So we can only do as much as we're allowed to, but the effort is definitely there on our part. And I can speak for myself and a number of people I know who work at our competitor stations. We all seek out that information to try and get those voices heard. But, you know, sometimes you just can't get those voices on the air because of whatever reason.
Jeremy, I want to just follow up on that a little bit, because I think in some stories we've heard, while there may be people in the street, it might be unclear, well, who is leading and who is actually speaking for this group. And then when that is unclear, then lots of labels and name calling can happen. This is that kind of group or this kind of group. So how, in doing your job, like, how do you hone in on who is leading and who is speaking for a group?
So, Stacey, that's an excellent question. I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the first things I get in my inbox all the time when I do a story and someone doesn't like who is portrayed for the person speaking for that group, I get fake news, I get biased, whatever it may be, I'm going to get a label for it. So the answer to that is vetting, vetting, and vetting again. That is one of the things that I was taught by not only my instructors in school and every news director or producer I've ever had, but at WGAL, I think we do an excellent job of, before we put a product on the air, we vet it, and vet it again. So if there's an organization or a person speaking, before that sound even gets the airwaves, I can tell you there have been 3, 4, 5 individuals saying, well, who is this person? What organization do they represent? Are they well known in the community? If so, what for? Where do they work? What do they do? How long have they been affiliated with this organization? You have to ask the questions. Now, when you're doing live coverage, you don't always get that chance to do in-depth vetting like that. But even in a live scenario, I have to say my photographer and I, and whoever I may be working with, we're going to have that conversation of, okay, if we're going to interview this person, okay, what do you think as far as, who they're affiliated with, the group that they're from? Do you think the answer is going to be all right? So we ask those questions. We do, whether it's in the field on the spot or whether it's when it's pre-taped and it goes back to the station and a script is being approved through those different levels of, producer, senior producer, and oftentimes, if we can't agree on it, the news director. Right. So those are the conversations that are had for that. Now, as far as deciding who speaks for whoever, like I said before, sometimes people don't want to speak out. The leader of the organization may tell, everyone from the top to the bottom, you can't say anything at all. So I may have a lead on a story and it matters, but if we can't have facts, we don't go on hearsay. We just don't do that. So oftentimes you may not see that story in the media, although it is going on, because again, sometimes you just don't have the source to speak. And I know the policy that we go by, if you don't have both sides, you don't need to air it.
Thanks for that, Jeremy. That was a really great answer. I'll be thinking about that as I follow your stories going forward and knowing what's actually behind them, all the effort behind them. Here's a question, Lydia, this might be you. So I think Friday, the county is reopening, or we're moving to green, right. I believe. So as we consider the new normal, how do you think the business community is going to engage historically marginalized communities in their planning for what's next and the reopening?
From the standpoint of, when I look at the green phase coming up, I don't know, honestly, how different it is from where we are right now. A little bit, but not tremendously so. So I don't know how much difference we're going to see in reaching out. I would certainly hope so, but I don't know what kind of difference that we're really going to see in that. We're looking at some places being open to a greater extent than they are now. So perhaps there'll be greater involvement in terms of support of that. I would certainly hope so. From the standpoint of supporting small businesses, supporting those folks who have really taken it on the chin during these last 3 and 4 months, many of which are businesses owned by people of color. So hopefully mobilizing from a supportive standpoint that way. And then we'll see. I mean, this has been such a crazy experience all the way through. It really has. We've all been kind of feeling our way.
Yeah. So, just pressing that point a little bit, if you're a small business owner, obviously you are making decisions for yourself and your family, or, a number of employees for you. But oftentimes the larger companies, may have Black and brown employees on the front lines. For example, we've seen this over and over, who, when the company wants to reopen, because of all the economic pressures, it's
right.
really the marginalized communities who are on the front line doing
right.
those jobs, and
right.
often without a voice
right.
in that.
Right. And I completely agree with that. And we've seen that through this time. And I am not, you know, our company, my former company, is not one that, to be honest, we're not a particularly diverse organization. But I haven't heard a lot of preparation or planning for that instance. I've heard a lot of concern about it, but I haven't heard a lot of preparation or planning. It's something that we need to think about.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think it was the mayor of Atlanta that I appreciated so much when someone asked her a question about what she was going to do tomorrow. And she said, I'm going to get up tomorrow and see what's in front of me, because all of us are in uncharted territory. And that goes for the reopening here in Lancaster as well.
Yeah.
So here's a powerful question in the chat box. Racism seems to deal with power. Why is it difficult for dominant groups to share power?
Wow, how much time do we have?
Oh, wow, that is a really good question.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you could go all the way back to ego. You could go, I mean, oh my gosh, that's a huge, huge question. You could go back to fear, significant fear. And nothing positive ever comes from significant fear. That's a really big question.
Well, that's a good start. Jeremy, what do you add there?
I'm going to say this. Lydia is absolutely right, but I think the big thing about racism, it's not about power. It's about empowerment. I think racism is something that's meant to make yourself feel better and bigger. I think as humans, we all instinctively have the need to compete, but racism is something that takes that to a whole new level. I think in our society, from the start of it, it was built so that we could have that edge over someone else. And if you don't have it intellectually, if you don't have it socially, if you don't have it economically, what other way could you have it? By the color of your skin. So I think that has a lot to do with it, because at the end of the day, when you want that edge over someone else, I think when you look as far back as the forming of our history, no one had anything. We were all forming the land and trying to figure out which way was which. I think you had a group of people that wanted to feel empowered, and they found a way to do it. And that was to take ownership over other people. And we've seen that happen time and time again with more than just Black people. We've seen it happen with Native Americans. We've seen it happen with Asian individuals. And we've seen it happen with Hispanics. So it's something that keeps repeating itself. And I think that's why.
Okay, Ari, I'm going to let you do the grand finale here on this question. Why is it difficult for dominant groups to share power?
I think we have to go back to, what do we all feel like when we have power? It, in a way, feels good. We may not know the negative effects that we have on others, or we may have the idea of what we're doing, which a lot of history tells us that people knew exactly what they were doing. But I think when we're thinking about this whole power dynamic, it definitely is, how does it make you feel? There was money to be made. There were things to do. So I think I agree with Jeremy that there's so much more to it than just, it's about power. It's about empowering and wanting something out of it. And I'm going to use whoever, my apologies, Bruno is here, is them wanting something. And so that's what I'll leave it with, is that we have to think about what it's like for us to have power and how that can negatively or positively affect us in our day-to-day lives.
You all gave actually really interesting perspectives, but they each had an emotional piece to them: fear, empowerment, and that feeling of control. So thanks for that great question and answers. Who is going to lead the Lancaster community to eliminate systemic racism?
I think that is a very simple question. And I'm going to just say you, the person who's watching, is going to lead that. Because each and every one of us have an obligation to make this world a better place. And how you do it is by educating, enlightening, and holding one another accountable. And that can only be done if each and every one of us plays a part in that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jeremy. Lydia, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I was going to say something quite similar in terms of it's all of our responsibilities. I do think the leadership question comes from the standpoint of it almost ties in a little bit to your question that you asked Jeremy, or someone asked Jeremy earlier about, how do you figure out who's in charge, and it is all of our responsibility, but there will be specific, especially when you're talking about dismantling a system, of systemic racism. There is going to be particular strategies and actions that must be taken that have to be in some way, funneled through some mechanism, right? So, but it is on all of us to keep pushing for that. I mean, I've been so impressed with, I can't remember how many days you said, 29 days now of these protests, mostly, to Ari's point earlier, young people, maybe not all Millersville though, Ari, but a lot of young people who quite honestly are leading this and saying that now is the time. So I completely agree with Jeremy. It's on all of us. I'll be honest, I've been in business for over 25 years in Lancaster County. And this time period has really kind of shaken my own foundation as a person who's been in business for a really long time. My focus in business, for anyone who knows me, is on how do you create a human-focused workplace where people can come to work as themselves and thrive and be understood. And yet I've never really looked deeply into systemic racism. I've focused on women's issues to a great extent. I've focused on the need for open and honest, transparent communication, and never really delved into this whole area of great, distressing fact. And so, and I'm someone, again, who this has been my work, is to try to create these environments. So I can say, I'm spending an awful lot of time now working really hard to understand and to learn. And I think that's part of what, when Jeremy says everyone and when I say everyone, I think that's something that all of us need to be doing. And we're smart enough to be able to, go get the books, go get the videos, go get the whatever, and learn, and then be part of the solution in dismantling this. That was a long-winded answer to your question.
Lydia, I appreciate your candor so much, because I think that there are many people who are taking that same walk that you just described, although it's not always easy to say, I have been not only working hard, but been successful in my field, and I didn't see it.
Right.
So I really appreciate that candor. Ari, I know that probably Millersville students and alumni will be part of creating this change in Lancaster County. Who else?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm sure our students can't wait to get back and start making some change. But along the similar lines as Lydia and Jeremy, I always tell people, you don't have to change the whole world, but you can change a part of your world. And whether that is a conversation with your best friends, your family, it's going to be uncomfortable, it's going to be difficult, but continuing to have those conversations and continuing to educate yourself. One of the things for me with the George Floyd incident is that I felt guilty for feeling numb, for watching that video and not feeling really anything. I didn't feel sad, I didn't feel angry. It just felt like, man, this is another one, and we're still not going to do anything about it. But then seeing people band together and start making a difference and going out and peacefully protesting has really helped change my perspective a little bit more. And also when you're educating people and you're educating yourself, you need to start normalizing changing your beliefs. It's okay to believe one thing an hour ago and educate yourself and believe a new thing now. And that's something that our society does not allow for. So when it comes to Lancaster County, a county that I absolutely adore, I definitely think starting with the small part of your world, and you may not think it's enough, but when everyone's doing their small part, it does change a lot. And so that's what my hope is.
Ari, you said something I love so much that I'm writing it down. It's okay to believe one thing, educate yourself, and then believe something different.
Yes.
And that is really the opportunity that's in front of all of us on so many sides of this movement right now. So we have a question that includes the word sides. Sometimes, quote, preventing both sides, end quote, means giving equal weight to a story or movement that is so extreme that it doesn't deserve equal weight, but it's given the appearance of being a popular position. Think not only those who deny institutional racism, but things like people who believe the earth is flat or people who are anti-vaccination. So are you fearful that presenting both sides can give legitimacy to a fringe element that doesn't deserve airtime? This is the question in the chat.
I think that I'm going to assume, since that says airtime, that's targeted to me. So I'll answer that one first. And I'll say that's something that we deal with quite a bit. You know, one of the things that we often get when we do government stories is when you're presenting something that may be considered right-wing or left-wing. If I go to a gun rally, there are going to be people who are pro-guns. If I go to a pro-life rally, there's going to be people who are, you know, of course, anti-abortion. It's hard to find 50-50 on those types of stories because when you're going into them, you're either for it or you're not. There is no fear on my part for airing both sides. But what I do in those instances, I give the viewer what I see if they were going to be there themselves. And I'm presenting it to them just that way. But the one thing we get all the time when we do that is flack for not representing both sides. And so to answer that question, I'll say this. We're not fearful, of presenting both sides, but you have to present both sides the way they are. You can't present them as anything other than that, because then you are perpetuating something that is not true. I think that even if something is the most extreme, you have to give it the airtime that you would give anything else, because you know what? There are people out there who believe that. And like Ari raised a point of earlier, it is okay to believe something and then maybe go back later and say, you know what? I'm going to educate myself. Maybe I was wrong. But people are entitled to believe whatever they want to, and that's their decision. You know, however the viewers interpret what we put together is up to the viewer. It's our job to present the news and not make it an agenda and push it.
Thanks a lot for that, Jeremy. I am sure that you get this type of question a lot, so thanks for indulging us as well. I have a question here for Lydia in particular. Are white people having discussions within their circles about the learning that they're doing? In other words, what happens after you read the books and watch the documentaries, which it has been the advice, you know, on social media platforms and even on different media, telling white people, go do the work, the information is there.
Right, most definitely. I mean, I can speak for myself and the circle of people that I'm involved with, but it's a very active topic, and learning and then discussing has been something that, at least for me and the circle of people that I'm involved with, that's the way we're doing it. And it's very interesting because we often are coming at it from super different vantage points, but I think that that's really good. And as you said earlier, some of these conversations are very uncomfortable. I can think of one that occurred on my back patio 2 weeks ago. So, you know, but so necessary. The businesses that I'm seeing doing like book discussions and so on, it is, you know, the intention is to have those discussions and then start talking about what they're learning and how can they practically put it into play. I think people are really waking up. I think people are really waking up. I hope people are really waking up.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. I think many white people who have not thought long and hard about these issues before and are people who consider themselves progressive or liberal or, you know, open-minded or non-judgmental, all of those words, are seeing what they missed. And certainly I get a lot of questions every day from friends and acquaintances, just acknowledging the areas that they had overlooked, willfully overlooked or inadvertently overlooked previously, and wanting to do better and more. And I think the operative thing right now is the action.
You're exactly right. And I think figuring out how do you, I mean, this sounds so simplistic, but it's how do you make sure people care? I mean, you can learn all you want, right? But how do you make sure that people care enough to take that next step?
Mm-hmm.
You know, especially, I mean, if you really look at a lot of things, and we had the question, you know, why do dominant folks not want to give up power? When you start looking at some of those things, you've got to make sure that in some way you're caring enough to take that action.
Yeah.
And that's been an interesting point of conversation as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Before we leave that question, ladies, I'd like to offer this input. One of the things that I've seen in my circles of friends, and I've got friends who are all different ethnicities and backgrounds. One of the things that really shocked me was that in the midst of them having those conversations, the next step for them was reaching out to me and saying, Jeremy, we've had this conversation and we wanted to let you know. And just for your perspective, what do we do? So if your circle is having that discussion, Lydia, one of the things that my girlfriends and guy friends have reached out to me, they've said, we don't know what we can do. We don't know if this is comfortable or uncomfortable for you, but we just want to ask because we want to know. Mm-hmm. And the feedback that I have for anyone who may be thinking about that in the back of their heads is do it. What's there to lose? Mm-hmm. You can only gain, if not knowledge, perspective. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to bring that up because there may be some people struggling with that, like a couple of my friends were when they brought that to my attention, that they wanted to bring me into those conversations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks for that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jeremy. Ari, I'm curious if you have a perspective the same or different on that question, if you're being asked.
I'll let Ari go for this one first, since I just got finished chatting and adding a few cents there.
So are we answering a new question or are we still in the last one?
Oh, sorry. I was just saying, you know, Jeremy was sharing that, you know, sometimes his friends want to ask him, you know, like, what should we do now? But they're not also unsure if they should be asking him in particular. And so and he's saying, just ask. I mean, at this point, let's just get something moving. And I'm just curious, is that your same perspective?
Yeah, I would agree. I've definitely had friends who would come to me and ask. Again, I would just say to keep in mind, I don't know everything. My experience is different. Obviously, my experience is different from Jeremy's experience in the ways that we've grown up, in the ways that we've been raised, in the environments we've been in. So just keeping that in mind. But I would definitely encourage people to definitely ask your friends. But I would encourage definitely asking your friends after you've already tried to have a conversation. Because if you come to me and you say, give me all you got, and I'm going to ask you, what did you already do? If you
Mhm.
say nothing, that's a problem, because most of us, if we're fortunate enough, have access to the internet. We have access to a library, and especially at Millersville, you have access to all of it if you're on campus. So if you come to me and ask me a question specifically about my personal experience, I'm willing to answer. I'm definitely willing to have a conversation, and I definitely have friends that don't agree with me, and that is okay. Again, it falls back into one day they may change their belief, and that's what I, hang on to with hope, is that they're going to understand, they're going to empathize. And I believe last time you showed the Brene Brown video was sympathy and empathy. And I love the way that she explains that, and that, you may not know everything, but you can at least try to be in their shoes and feel that. And so that's what we're asking people to do, is just to kind of feel what that experience is like being Black in America, or being a person of color in America. Just because our experiences are not the same, but we definitely would encourage you to ask. I know personally for me, after some of these incidences, it's a little difficult for people to ask me. I'm a little on edge, I don't want to answer, but give it some time. A lot of times I'll reach out to friends, and a few are even on the call today that have reached out and said, what can I do? And we've just kind of sat down and gone through, what can you do? And it doesn't have to be this huge thing, like I said before. It can be small things like calling into your local police department and asking what their protocols are, and what they should be required to do, and all that stuff. And so that's just a simple thing that you can do, is just make a phone call and ask some of those questions.
Thanks for that, each of you. And I want to draw folks' attention in the chat. There's a link in the headline of it. I'm your Black friend, but I won't educate you about racism. That's on you. And I think you all kind of hit on the point of people need to educate themselves, and then depending on your relationship with someone, it can be fine to ask follow-up questions about
Well, Stacey, the one thing I want to touch on that comment there is, I don't know, there's oftentimes people get confused. There's a big difference. And right now, everyone's on edge, like Ari said. But I think that we have to do our part in distinguishing what's racial and what's racist. And right now, things are going very close to that thin line. And I think why I tell my friends to ask me is because that big World Wide Web out there is a wonderful tool, but it is also a very, very harmful one if you don't know what you're looking for. And me asking or telling my friends who aren't, knowledgeable of African American history to go search for themselves is almost like telling a toddler to go potty train themselves. How can you know something about something you've never experienced? So while a lot of things can be self-taught, you can't self-teach everything. I think you need some guidance in some way, shape, or form. So I think if you have one friend who may not feel comfortable, ask around until you get the yes, because I think that conversation is very important, because you have to have a starting point.
Jeremy, I appreciate that. And so I will say for folks on the call, this is our second Community Now discussion. And after the first one, on our website under Community Now, we did list all of the links to the sources that we had touched on that evening. And we're going to do the same thing tonight. And so I would say that I feel confident that the sources we list are sources that you can find trustworthy information. And in many cases, it's information that we actually use ourselves in our racial equity trainings and work in the community. And certainly, if anyone ever has questions about any of the resources we are sharing from YW, I welcome the questions and would love to talk that through. Here is
really quick. What I took from what Ari said as the white person on the panel here was that if I do absolutely nothing and I go to my Black friend and say, educate me, that's in a way we're just playing out that power relationship, and it's a one-sided thing. And I really appreciate that. I get that. And then Jeremy, I'm hearing what you're saying, but when you're confused or you just need some direction, whatever, But I really heard that loud and clear, and I think that's a really good point to be making.
Yep. Yep.
You're absolutely right about that, Lydia. The side that I come from on the issue is because one of the things that I've really heard over and over from friends is that, wow, I didn't know what white privilege was until I didn't know what I didn't know. You know, they're looking at the media and they're looking at these conversations and it clicks for them. And that's why I say, just ask, because sometimes when you realize that it's a privilege that you don't know anything about this, sometimes you do need a starting point. So that's why I'm glad that we do have those differing perspectives on this, Ari and I on that.
Yep. So here's a wonderful specific Lancaster County question. It's a big county. How do we talk to our friends in the southern part of the county that still host KKK rallies and defends the Confederate flag? So, you know, essentially, how do we talk to folks who are holding up one of the symbols in particular and one of the recognized or are members of what is a recognized hate group in America? What about that here in Lancaster County?
Go ahead, Jeremy.
I was going to say, from my perspective, I've had to cover a lot of areas. And one of the things I encountered in my career was someone basically telling me to my face, they're like, you know, I'm not really a fan of African Americans, but I'll talk to you. One of the things that I did is just, you act just like you normally would. Just be as calm as you can. Talk like we're having a conversation right now, because you don't know what is going across the screen. You don't know what they're seeing in their backyard. You don't know what their life experience has been. They may have never had a positive experience with someone of color or whoever, whatever demographic they may be hateful towards. So one of the things that I took away from that interview is that gentleman said, you know, I've never had a positive experience before. And I said, you know what, sir? I said, I want you to remember this experience because there are millions of people around this world who are just like me, who mean no harm. What you see on television, I don't know what you're watching. I don't know what you're seeing, or I don't know what you've been through. But I said, I would like to apologize on that person's behalf. And moving forward, I would like for you to open yourself up to be around more positive people and positive representations of people that look like me. So that's my answer to that question. Because a lot of the times, you know, the media does play into that. I mean, sometimes people watch a certain station or a certain channel and they may see a certain agenda and they have that in their head about certain types of people. So.
That's a great story. You have a lot of stories, Jeremy, and I'm sure we aren't even scratching the surface of what you've seen and experienced doing your job. Lydia, you were about to jump in there too, though.
Yeah, I think what I put to that is context and contextualize whatever the thing is, and then get curious and ask questions. And that sounds really simple, and it's not. But that's what I would recommend, is getting really curious about it and seeing where that goes. And then sometimes it's not going to go anywhere, and that's okay. You move forward.
Right. Ariana, do you run into this?
Quite often, actually. But it always begins with a great conversation. Nothing comes from arguing and yelling. I think just having an understanding of where both sides are coming from really helps with that. I would mention, again, I'm originally from Gettysburg, so none of this stuff is new. And again, coming to Lancaster County, it's better. I will say it's better, but not much better when we're talking about the southern part of the county. And so when the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, the Battle of Gettysburg happened, there was also that uprising with it's heritage, not hate, with the flag, the Confederate flag. And so during that time, I worked in tourism. And so it was a huge, huge thing with people coming in wanting to have conversations. And again, I was one Black person in all of the places that I worked in. And so having those conversations with people was difficult, especially when it's kind of hostile because they're in power when I'm just the customer is always right type situation. And so it always has to be a genuine conversation and just understanding. I always like to try and understand where that individual is coming from. And sometimes you have to agree to disagree, and that's okay too. But I always try to educate myself, be aware, understand that person's life experience, because there may have been a lot that goes into it. And there's this nice clip, I believe from National Geographic or the History Channel, where they ask this guy who was like, it is heritage, not hate. And then they ask, what are other two things other than slavery that, the war was fought about? And he was like, he couldn't really answer. So, that just goes to show, although you have had family members fight in a war and have sacrificed their life, doesn't mean they will be forgotten. But we also can't have this symbol of hate just waving around everywhere. And so trying to educate once again and have an understanding is a good start, definitely.
Thanks for that. So now we're in the tricky part where I love all of these remaining questions, and I'm also watching the clock a little bit. So I actually want to jump down to, or up, however it is. The question is, or the statement, listening seems to be job one. And I'm choosing this question because that's absolutely where I see YWCA right now, and why we are hosting these discussions. So the rest of the question is then, what is the best way to listen to the concerns and questions in Lancaster about Black Lives Matter? And I'm interpreting this to mean the movement of Black Lives Matter. So what is the best way to listen right in this county right now?
That's a good one, because I don't want to tout my own industry by saying turn on the news, but at the same time, we are in a pandemic. It's kind of hard for me to encourage someone to say, oh, well, if there's a rally near you, go out. So I'm not going to do that. But what I will say is the best way to listen is look at the resources around you. They're in television stations, radio stations. There are plenty of organizations like the YWCA, and there are plenty of avenues where people are talking about this in real time, and you can get the information you need and you can decipher what you want from it. And if you don't like that, then you can have the conversation and take it to the next step and say, I saw this, this, and this. What's your take on it? What can we do? It's kind of like Ari and I both said before, you have to kind of do the work, as she said, and then, as I said, you have to then take that work and then decide if you want to have the conversation with a friend and say, what does this mean? And gain some understanding about it.
Yeah. Ari, what's your advice about the best way to listen right now about Black Lives Matter?
I definitely want to jump off of Jeremy and having this idea of creating a space. So we do listen to the radio, we watch TV, we look at the resources, and we take advantage of those things. But we have to ask ourselves, when was the last time that we just came together in one space? Now, granted, again, there's a pandemic, but maybe just coming to a park and just hearing someone speak and then asking those questions. And it has become a little harder, again, like I said, because of the pandemic, but getting out there and going to events. And something I love about Lancaster County is it's very cultural and it's diverse, and there's so much to do, especially in the city. And so going to things that would take you outside of your comfort zone or attending virtual things that would also take you outside your comfort zone a little bit, and having those discussions and wanting to learn more and be active. Also just going into a community you may not normally go into, and getting to have just normal conversation, getting to know your neighbor a bit more, is something I would find really, really important. For me, I live in the country, so it's a little harder, but being able to get to know the people that you live around will definitely help diversify you a little bit more, and also learn more about Black Lives Matter, because I think with Black Lives Matter, it's become more than just Black lives at this point. We have definitely spread out quite a bit to include all people of color, watching gangs band together, and then other nationalities band together for one cause. It has definitely grown much more outside of Black Lives Matter, but definitely their website as well is pretty easily accessible to kind of walk through as well.
Lydia, what would be your tools to listen to the concerns and questions about Black Lives Matter right now?
Yeah, well, one thing I want to just piggyback on what Ari said was that for sure the conversations are so important, and you can do so much by looking at information, but having the conversations I think are really, really key. I think I've come to really realize that if I want to have, and I tend to put things in a business lens, so excuse me for that, but if I want to be able to lead a diverse team, which I do, in general, I need to lead a diverse life. So I need to get out and experience different things, whether it's cultural events, as you said, or it's restaurants, or it's books, or it's, whatever, and the conversations, that's critical. So I can't wait for this pandemic to be done so that we can gather, because I think it's that this is an issue of humanity. It's that human to human contact and conversation and back and forth that I think is really, really critical.
I love that. I love that. That is what it's about, recognizing humanity.
Mm-hmm.
I want to let folks on the call know, first of all, thank you so much again for joining us. Let's have some final thoughts from the panelists. What do you want to leave us with? What was left unsaid? And what do you want us to really understand about what's happening in Lancaster County? And Ari, we'll start with you.
Yeah. I do want to hit on a couple of these questions that are in here, as well as it pertains to how to talk to family and close friends, and explaining white privilege. And again, it wasn't till college that I realized that there was more than just white privilege. We always get that shoved in the back of our heads, but we also need to recognize is that there's what some might call straight privilege or heterosexual privilege, and the fact that you don't have to worry about the partner that you bring home because it is normal. Or talking about ableism, and the fact that I'm able to run, walk, play, do whatever, and others are not. So that's also a privilege, and also having money is a privilege. And these aren't things that I did to make happen. And trying to explain to someone that it's nothing that you did. It doesn't mean that your life wasn't hard. It just means that it's one thing not making your life harder. And it may be putting it into a different perspective for other people to understand is you were born able-bodied. We're not blaming you for being born able-bodied, but you could utilize your abilities to help someone else and assist in efforts in other ways, like making other places ADA accessible and making other things accessible to other people. And then in the fact that we're talking about families and how do we talk with them, it starts with love, it does. And it's tough love sometimes. It's going to be difficult. These conversations aren't easy to have, even in my own family, not easy to have. Emotions are gonna spiral, relationships may crumble, but at the end of the day, continuing to have these conversations is only going to build our community stronger. And Lancaster County has always been a forerunner in being a strong community. And that's what I love so much about it, is that we always try to band together when things get hard, especially when there were bans on travel and we kept immigrants coming in. And that was something I loved. And so again, just staying strong and trying to move forward and educating others is one thing I want to leave people with.
Thanks, Ari. Thanks so much. Jeremy, how about you? What are your final thoughts?
The one thing I want to say, sorry we couldn't get to all of these questions because I've been reading over them and they are really good, but I will leave everyone with this. This is not about being right on the left. This is not about being politically correct on the right. This is a human rights issue. Making sure that all lives are counted for and that all lives matter, and that we correct a problem in our society that's been going on for well over 400 years, and that is the cruel treatment of African Americans. And so the first thing I want to say is that in order to fix the problem, we all have to play a part. Whether you agree with white privilege or whether you agree with police reform, the first question you need to look in the mirror and say, when you hear what's going on in our world today, and I'll use this one as the example, George Floyd, for instance, regardless of what you think about that person, the way that the incident happened, what if that was your child or your family member? That is what I want to let people know. It is not about the policies, it's about the treatment, and it's about what we need to do moving forward. And if you can justify that, if you can justify what the cruel things that are happening to people for no reason, I think you need to look at yourself in the mirror and you need to have a huge readjustment. And I think that's what I want to leave people with, is that the first step of this is looking in the mirror and reflecting and saying, okay, what do I need to do and where do I start?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you for that, Jeremy. And Lydia, what are your final thoughts?
Yeah, I'm thinking about everything they just said, and I'm learning that we can have beliefs that are so deeply held, we don't even know we have them, right? And in conversations that I have with friends right now, when that's pointed out to someone, shame can come into play pretty quickly. And I'm a big, I've read a lot of Brene Brown on shame and vulnerability and those kinds of things, and it's a real thing, right? And so that can really come into play, but honestly, shame doesn't help at all in this case. And it kind of corrodes the belief that I can be better, that I can make change when you're in a shame way. So it gets in the way of really better understanding, I think, and it's a self-indulgence we don't have time for. And so I would say that would be the thought I would just want to leave with the group.
You're right where I am, Lydia. We don't have time. We don't have time for that indulgent guilt and shame right now. Thank you, all three of you, so much. I have enjoyed this conversation and I've learned several things. I have some notes myself to follow up on. So for everyone who joined us tonight, this is our second dialogue of 3 that we planned. You will be notified of the next one in just a couple weeks, and you'll automatically be registered and receive the link. You don't have to do anything to get the link next time. And I really hope that you will, as I will, take some of what you learned tonight, follow up on some of those links, learn a little bit more, and share it with someone else. You know, as you heard repeatedly tonight, it's an opportunity to have more conversations and deepen our understanding right now about what to do next and how to make change. Before you leave, in the chat box is an exit poll. And I hope that you will, it's real short, it'll just take you a couple minutes, but we'd love your feedback. We use the feedback from last time to improve our series tonight. So thank you so much. Please continue your reflection, and from YWCA Lancaster, and we really appreciate the community engagement in these dialogues. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay.